Hi everyone. Hope everyone is safe and well through this coronavirus pandemic. And I've been overwhelmed with the support of my podcast. 200 people have listened to the first episode, which is amazing. And I can't thank you enough for the support. It's been fantastic. So we've got the next installment coming up for you guys, which is the Dutch New Guinea campaign of World War II and the Australians fighting from 1942 right up to 1945, and the significance that campaign was. Well, we all know it was significant in the Pacific War. But I just wanted to let you know that the quality of the episode, we have had a few technical issues with recording this episode. My editor and I have done a great job to edit it as best we can. But I do just want to let you know that the content it's good, and it's the best quality that we could get it due to the technical issues that we had. But that's just the way it is with technology. Everyone knows it's just one of those things that we can't control, but we did do our best to try and edit it as best we can. So I really do appreciate the support, guys, and we've got some great content coming up on the show. We've got next episode is the Fallen Diggers Incorporated episode, and I caught up with the two boys who founded that, and that was a really great chat. We spoke on Anzac Day and had a really, really great chat. And then we move into the Battle of Bulcour of 1917. So we've got some great content coming up. And if you can, continue to support the podcast and help me to continue my passion. And I can't thank you enough. So, guys, hope you all stay safe during this coronavirus pandemic. And we will get through it all together. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Cheers, guys. Hi, welcome to True Blue History. I'm your host, Adam Blum. Come with me behind the lines as we explore all things military history. Today's episode is special to me as we look at the Dutch New Guinea campaign. This is important to me because my grandfather served there in World War II, and it's where my passion for military history began. I'm joined to talk more about the campaign by David Howell, a Melbourne-based historian and the owner of Kokoda Historical Tours. Hi Dave, thanks for joining us on the podcast. And as I said in the intro, it's a special topic for me because it's where my grandfather fought in World War II in the Dutch New Guinea campaign. And Dave, can you just tell us what the Dutch New Guinea campaign was about and how long it went for?
Yeah, so I guess most Australians think about New Guinea or the territories to our north, which I'll come to in a minute, but as being, I guess, the war on our doorstep. And it certainly was, with the pivotal year being 1942, although the battle goes, or correction, the campaign goes from 42 until 45. But I think to sort of put it in context is that the territory to our immediate north, which is what we would now call PNG and West Papua, was the closest landmass. In fact, our furthest northern point to New Guinea, or Papua New Guinea's mainland, is only 160 km, so there's the most southern point, right? So very close, on our doorstep. But if you take your mind back to the Second World War from the Australians' perspective, a lot of people would have heard of New Guinea and would have used the term New Guinea for all of that area up there, but probably not understanding the three very different controls over the territory. There was three areas. And just to understand it, New Guinea, which is, if you're looking at a map, everything to the right and to the north, so above, it's hard without seeing the map, but imagine a line going down through the middle part of the right-hand side of the main island, PNG. Everything to the north, which includes East New Britain and New Ireland, that had once been under German control. And in the First World War, Australia was pivotal in an operation there, a battle called Bitter Parker, which happened on the 11th of September 1914, our first action in the Great War. And then subsequently, we garrisoned it, and after the First World War, Treaty of Versailles, etc., that was mandated territory. So it became mandated territory. Everything below was where Port Moresby, the capital, was Papua. And everything over to the left is what we call West Papua now, or Irian Jaya, which Indonesia controls. At that time, was a territory of the Netherlands, and it was commonly referred to as Dutch New Guinea.
Right. Okay. And so, what was with the so who was actually in Dutch New Guinea? So, what battalions and what who was like? Was there a big force that went to Dutch New Guinea, or was it small groups, or what was it, Dave?
Well, in the course of those years, 42 to 45, you had roughly, I think it was 2,000 Allied personnel there, which I think you could safely say incorporates United Kingdom, the Netherlands, the United States and Australia, and even if you want to break it down a little bit more, Papua and New Guinea forces. Without confusing it, you could all group those under Australian forces at the time. I think it's important to note that strategically, from the Japanese point of view, those territorial gains in the area in which these battles were fought were part of a larger operation for them within the area, which you could suggest, at least in the early part, that stretched as far over to the south, if not beyond, to places like East Timor, Morotai, and then obviously if you go over to, that's in the west, and then if you go over to the east, it would stretch as far as the Solomon Islands and to Guadalcanal, which obviously was quite famous in big battles that happened in that area in the Pacific. And this, I guess, you could suggest is part of the Japanese idea, or rather their aim, their objective, to create this co-prosperity sphere is what they called it, but to put these buffer zones out above the territories in the area in which they had taken and that they wanted to hold. And just like now, all of that territory to the north, and at the time I should say as well, for countries like Australia, was part of our buffer zones, protecting mainland Australia from any threat. And in 1942, obviously that threat was Imperial Japan.
Yeah, it seems to be like, obviously for me, that's where my passion for military history started with. Was hearing of where my grandfather fought, but it seems to be that the Dutch New Guinea campaign seems to be sort of forgotten, and because obviously Kokoda was important, and Bougainville later on, and Guadalcanal, and was the Dutch New Guinea campaign, was it as important as Kokoda and Bougainville and in the overall Pacific War? Was it a key? Were they key actions that were fought there, or?
Yeah, look, that's probably hotly contested, but 2 points I'd make on that. The first one is that the famous Australian military historian John Laffin, he wrote that it was arguably the most arduous fought by any of the Allied troops, which is obviously to do with the terrain. So it was a very difficult campaign, which we can come to later if you like, in terms of and even to this day, there's vast areas which the war never reached, but very few modern day society has not or civilization has not touched it. Although that's changing now, but certainly in 1942. But I guess the other important thing is that it was overtaken. So after at the point of 1942, when we had Japan literally knocking on our doorstep, it reached a point where it turned against the Japanese, and then we, when I say we, the Allies, were pushing the Japanese back, and certainly the Japanese were withdrawing or consolidating pockets of areas all across the Pacific, and basically fighting for their foothold and then eventually their lives. So I think why it's not as well known in Australia, and it certainly isn't, is because you had other events take over, and certainly world events. So we've got, from the Americans' perspective, they continued on after 42 on their island hopping campaign with the intent to get to Japan, and they bypassed a lot of the areas, or had limited assets and resources used in those campaigns. And I think from the Australian perspective, although there was, a considerable effort by Australia in there and during the war, I think it gets overshadowed. And certainly in recent times, it would be overshadowed, because if you ask somebody who is not necessarily into Australian military history, names a battle in New Guinea, etc., they're obviously going to name Kokoda. And whilst Kokoda is important, it's only the tip of the iceberg for Australians' involvement in that whole region to our north.
Yeah. So once, if the people visit Dutch New Guinea today, and if they do, is there still is it still like a battlefield today, or is it become more so urbanized, and obviously people, the war has, since it's 75 plus years ago now. Is it back to is it urbanization now, or are we talking about jungle? Is it still all jungle, or can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just to put in perspective, so up until 1942, when the Japanese, in March, 29-30 March 42 is when the Japanese come into what was then Dutch New Guinea. That kind of, I guess, ended the influence, which had been there for a long period of time, of the Netherlands, control over that area. And following on from the fallout of the Second World War, as what happened with the most empires, or rather countries that had overseas possessions, and that after recovering from the war, was the least of having outposts in very far away. In the case of the Dutch, it was no good for them to be. It wasn't tenable for them to do that. And this is, I guess, the post-war stuff is the most controversial. And to answer your question, I've never been there, and it would be very difficult for you or I. Not just because of COVID-19 going on now, but at the best of times, it would be very difficult for you or I to visit there. And the reason that is because it is controlled by Indonesia. In fact, it would be ignorant, and it would be irresponsible for anybody to talk about this subject in its modern context to not at least touch on the fact that Indonesia is set about, and it has done for a long period of time now, really since the 1960s, where it has colonised West Papua, Irian Jaya as they call it, or West Irian, but they are hell-bent on taking that and taking it over. And without going into the politics too much, even this day, up on the border between Papua New Guinea, the sovereign country of Papua New Guinea, and West Papua, there is big lines painted on rocks denoting the border. The Indonesian military and their security forces patrol it. And if you or I were to walk across that without proper documentation, which, by the way, is hard to get, we would be arrested, and it wouldn't be something that, they wouldn't just say, oh, I'm sorry, you've wandered into this area. You would be in trouble. So on top of that, there is only best described as genocide going on there at the moment. And as I said before, without politicising it too much, in the post-war years, it has not been very favourable for the people of West Papua. And unfortunately, it is a battlefield that I would love to go to. I haven't been to it, but I would love to go to it. But it is, at the moment, it is just not tenable for any Australian to go and visit, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a shame because I can hear it, and as I speak to you, yeah, it's definitely, if you're allowed to see it, it'd be a part of history that we'd be able to see, a forgotten chapter of history, and I can hear that from you that it's a shame that that it wasn't it wasn't kept and as Papua New Guinea, and that Indonesia obviously took it, and without sounding controversial, I understand why it's a forgotten battle, because you obviously today no one can visit what happened in World War II. So it's I guess, to put it, and sorry to go back to one of the questions you asked me there about the type of the geography of it, or what it would be like. It is always been, even when the Dutch had control of it, and the fighting in the Second World War for the most part was coastal areas, coastal settlements. Large proportions of the population live in or just near to coastal areas. Even today, I mean, the largest city in West Papua is a place called Jayapura, and the people live near the coast, because the hinterland, the interior of it, to this day is probably one of the few places left on the planet which hasn't had much interference by man, by humans, either in settlement or even exploration. And you've got some amazing cultural and diverse groups, because the whole region, of course, is one of the most, which includes what is now Papua New Guinea, is, I think there's somewhere along the lines of 800 different dialects in PNG alone, but in West Papua, that would be a continuation of that. And you've got these, one of the large tribes that come to mind, and probably the more famous is the Danai of the tribe, and they're mainly a coastal people, but there's a lot of people living out in the hinterland, in the mountains, in the jungle, in the rainforest, that has probably not had very little contact with the outside world, and if they have, it's probably been with interacting, maybe not in a nice manner, with people from what is Indonesia. And then I should also say there too, which is something to think about, is that you've got a lot of other species of animals and plants and things like that, which they're always coming up with a new plant or a new animal, or a derivative of a species or something in Papua New Guinea. So I'm sure there's, it's the same continent. I'm sure there's many of those things out there that we've not yet known. So actually, from that point of view, it was a very interesting place, and I would love to be able to get in there one day for that, but obviously to go and visit, the battlefields of the campaign. Well, let's hope in the future that we can do that. I hope that in the future we can. But Dave, just to go back to what you said, where the 42,000 served on or during the Dutch New Guinea campaign. Of that, of those men, do we know how many were actually wounded or killed during the campaign? Yeah,
so I believe a combined figure from the Allied forces, which, as I said before, includes the United States, Australia, the Netherlands, and of course the United Kingdom. We're not sure of the overall strength during those years, 42 to 45, but we do know that there's approximately nearly 2,000 either killed or missing, with around about 8 or so thousand wounded. So it is considerable. I mean, to give you an idea, although in a shorter period of time, but we think Kokoda, New Guinea, you had roughly around about 600 odd people die in that campaign. And I don't like odds and I don't like comparisons of this, but everyone knows about Kokoda, and we had roughly 1,500 down on the Northern Beachheads campaign or at Bunagona and Santananda. But you think about it, and that was in a shorter period of time, of course, 42, 43, but you think about, the fact that, nearly, 1,900 odd Allied soldiers were killed or went missing, and probably their remains are still out, in the jungle somewhere, and you had 8,000 odd people wounded. So it is by no means, over the course of those years, so the 3 odd years that it goes for, that you would think that it would make a little bit more than a footnote in history, because unfortunately that's what it seems to be at the moment, for better or worse.
Yeah, it's like, obviously, like for me, it's an interest because I've got family connections, but it's something that if you do try and look it up, it seems to only be that you get the whole Papua New Guinea campaign. It doesn't seem to be as much information on the Dutch New Guinea region and campaign. And do you feel that there could be potential for research to be obviously discovered, but because no one's been there, I guess, is it hard to get that history, or
Look, I think there has been histories written over the years, of course, and I shouldn't say that it's never been touched. I think we're talking more in a contemporary sense, that it has been overshadowed by Kokoda and these other places. But I think that that it would very well, even if you could not go there, it would be very well that somebody is only waiting to come along and to bring the history back into the fore, so to speak, and to have a look at through new eyes, I guess. And I think it should be done. Now, look, I must say, when I really first touched on this, and I still am no expert on it, not like the campaigns of the First and Second World War in New Guinea and Papua, but I would suggest that when I first got involved in this, I had met a couple of veterans over the course of what I do, and some of them had served there. And I remember one chap from an amalgamated infantry battalion, the 31st, 51st Infantry Battalion, had fought there in 44, I think. And he's a guy, I don't know if he's alive, his name will come to me in a minute, but I still remember discussing with him at length about his time up there, and he mentioning that it was overshadowed by other places like Milne Bay or the Kokoda campaign and stuff like that. And I guess most of the veterans have moved on now, but I definitely think that you could come and revisit it and bring it back to the fore, because I think that as a society, and as we get mature after coming out of the centenary years of Anzac, and there's this thirst for more knowledge on Australian military history, that it would be good for people to have another look at something that is so close to home. Because remember what I said earlier on in this interview, that we are very, very close. It's our nearest neighbour, and it is something that we should pay more attention to, not just for learning about the past, but also I suggest it could serve as well, given the current climate and into the future.
Yeah, it's a great point you make, and obviously, like as you just said, as you mentioned, with the as we've just come out of the centenary of the First World Wars, Do you think that now Australia, the Australians, people will shift to the Second World War centenaries, and do you feel that obviously there's been a few 75th anniversaries that have been missed, or there will be this year due to coronavirus, and do you feel that Australians will start to shift now that we've finished with the First World War? Do you think the Second World War now people will start taking interest, or?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that, and I'm not taking away from the First World War centenary, as I know yourself and have travelled and took a lot in for it. I certainly did. I was working in the Shrine of Remembrance and the build-up to it, and went through all that and saw how new generations got involved and got interested in Australian military history, in particular at that time, obviously the First World War. But I think that, I think this year is interesting because of the COVID-19 situation, 75th anniversary. I think a lot of it will be allayed next year. It'll come, it'll be delayed until next year, and it'll come to the fore. I think we have wet our whistle. I think our appetite is still there, and I think that we've matured enough now to try and look beyond just Anzac and to go and find out certainly what World War II. And remember, we still have people. We still have, although there's not a lot, but we still have people who are among us who served, and also people who were alive, family members, civilians, all those people who the Second World War has had a huge impact on their life, and it leaves a huge legacy, and we should not forget that. I mean, imagine if you could go back to when they took the last veterans to Gallipoli. I was a bit young for that, but imagine if you were there, or if I asked you, hey, would you like to come and have a meal or a dinner with World War I veterans? You obviously would all jump at the chance now, because we don't have that chance, but we still have it now. Although the flame is about to be extinguished, we still have that, and you have people who are still walk among us, and I would suggest especially the latter units, because the campaign in Dutch New Guinea for Australia sort of reached its sort of peak around 44. That you've still got people who are alive out there, and in fact, just this chat this evening, I will endeavour to go and try and make contact again with those people that I have spoken to over the years, because I'm sure there are still some people out there, and from a World War II point of view, with the 75th anniversary of the end of it, it's a momentous occasion. And I think that we would do well as a society to, when we get back out of this lockdown period, to give it the due recognition it deserves.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's something we owe these men, and we do them a disjustice if we don't, get behind them and obviously, ask them their stories, and because their stories are there to be heard and to be told. Like they, we should be hearing their stories. It was a shame for me when my grandfather, when he died, I was only 6. So I was, I do wish in a way that I was older to actually ask him. Although he never spoke of his time in service. He was a very reserved man. He didn't really speak of from what my father and my uncle have told me, that he didn't really speak of his wartime service, but. Which I understand. I get that. Obviously, studying it, and you've studied it as well. It's a terrible business to be part of, and it's not very nice, and certainly it's But there's obviously stories that need to be told, and I think. We as a nation, we should be listening to them. I really do. You agree with that, Dave? Or
yeah, 100%. Look, I 100%. I think that if look, to give you an idea, of course, if you would ask somebody who otherwise wouldn't necessarily know about in depth, and I'm not expecting everyone get as excited or as involved in it. Some people only have a fleeting interest. I understand that that's fine, but if you were asked somebody on the street to name two battles, Australian battles of all time, you'd probably say Gallipoli, and then you'd say Kokoda maybe. They're sort of things brought to the fore. But to bring us back to the West Papuan campaigns, Dutch New Guinea, and the areas that were fought over in there, like there's a teepee Wewak, which was up very close to this area, fought at the end of the war. There's the Battle of Hollandia. There's the landing at a teepee. There's operations called Reckless and Persecution. There's a Battle of Lone Tree Hill, and then you've got Morotai and all these other places. Were one that we probably don't realise about. The biggest battle in Dutch New Guinea, of course, was the Battle of Lone Tree Hill. It was mainly the United States against the Japanese, United States forces against the Japanese. But to give you an idea of the size, this has happened in 1944. You've got 400 US soldiers dead, and you've got nearly 4,000 Japanese dead from the combat fighting. You've got over 11,000 of Imperial Japanese soldiers that have died from sickness and starvation. So, and I think they only took around, less than 100. It might have only been 50 or so Japanese prisoners in that time. I mean, that's extraordinary losses. And again, bringing ourselves back to the fact that this is in the island that's just above Australia. And it didn't, 44, 76 odd years ago, it's not that still within living memory. And we would be wise, I guess, to bring this back to the consciousness of Australia, at least just to mark that respect.
Those numbers are staggering. I didn't know that was wow. See, this is like, obviously for me, Dave. This is a part of history that I'm actually learning myself as I'm talking to you. I'm learning as well, and it's World War II. It's obviously, as I said, this talking about the Dutch New Guinea campaign. It's a passion to me, but I'm learning myself, and I just those numbers are staggering. Like that's more than the losses at Lone Pine, like for the Japanese, like that, and yet it's the first time I'm hearing of it. Like that's unbelievable. Like it's staggering.
Well, I think Itaipi and Wewak campaign, which wasn't actually technically. It's very close. If you look at the map, top left-hand side of mainland New Guinea, on the border of what is now West Papua and Jaya. But the Itaipi Wewak campaign, which happened right at the end of the war. In fact, where I'm talking to you in my study, I have a large Japanese flag on my wall from the 2nd Battalion, who had a fight. A contact, I should say, rather, with the Japanese at a place. I've got this big flag shadowing here. Obviously, Ted Kenner, who got the Victoria Cross, comes to mind. But these are things that haven't quite. They're in the back of a lot of Australians' minds. Certainly, if they had a family member. But that is something that I particularly. There's a battle in itself that is part of the final campaigns, as the official history gave the name to the volume that covers that, and this is things that go on from November till August, November 44 to August of 45 when the Japanese surrendered. But you have, you have a high number of Australians up there. You have a lot of Australians, including Australians who had fought in other campaigns, either in the Middle East or the ill-fated Greek campaign, that go and lose their lives up there. In fact, referring back to that flag, I'm looking at the meatball. If you imagine the meatball in the Japanese flag, there's a guy, Lieutenant Shanahan, and I tracked him down. There's been a guy who was a corporal and escapes from the Greek campaign, walks overland, makes it to Turkey and gets repatriated, only to die, I think, in March of 45 in that campaign. And now again, we've got nearly 500 Australians killed in that campaign from the fighting, and you think you got nearly 150 odd people killed or die rather from diseases, and 1,200 odd people wounded. It's quite something in terms of Australia's population at the time, and our main effort towards the end of the war. Because of course, other than Fighter Bomber Command and some naval elements that participated in the European theatre of operations, we had recalled most of our forces back, obviously, in 1942 to get rid of the Japanese threat when America had moved on its island hopping campaign. It didn't really take Australians with it, but we were left to go and to clean up. And there's a lot of controversy about whether or not they should have just left the Japanese, including in Dutch New Guinea and New Guinea itself, and places like East New Britain up in the northeast, whether you should have just left the Japanese there because they couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't do anything. But it's very important to note that whilst Dutch New Guinea was not Australian territory, New Guinea itself had been mandated after the First World War and up very close to those areas. We're on Australian mandated. It's Australian territory, and we had an enemy who was still showing aggression on our territory. So what else would you do? You would go and get neutralise that threat, and that's what a lot of young Australian servicemen had to do. And of course, any of those type of operations you're going to launch, you're going to have a toll, and the toll is that Australians paid the ultimate sacrifice doing that. And I think that we should pay more attention, and we should want to have the thirst to learn more, because it's only by giving recognition and paying attention as we mature as a country to these localised conflicts that we will gain a greater understanding. And as I said to you earlier on, it's something for the future, because again, all these areas are buffer zones from mainland Australia, and given the current climate, we should definitely be paying more attention to the history, but also to where it serves us in the future and the present.
You've summed that up really well, Dave. That's and from just to touch on a key point, from what you said, where New Guinea was Australian territory after the First World War. Could you I think to that now, and I just because everyone, for our listeners who don't know, Japan was an ally in the First World War. They were an ally to us, and can you just briefly touch on that? At the end of the peace treaty, they actually wanted New Guinea as part of their land, wasn't it? They actually
I think for the very important, and I'm very passionate about this, is to think that when war was declared, this is the Great War, the First World War. When the First World War was declared, Australia's first overseas operation was Britain had asked Australia, as it had New Zealand, to go and take, and for New Zealand it was what was then German Samoa, but for Australia to go and take out the communications, the wireless tower, if you will, in East New Britain, or was then New Pomian and Rabaul, to go and remove that. And I argue that it was probably a significant and most important battle for Australia. It only went for one day. There was one army chap, Pockley, and the rest were naval guys. So six deaths on our side, one German. It only went for a day. It was our first dawn landing, by the way, and it went till the afternoon on the Bitterparker Road. There's a cemetery up there called Bitterparker, which has World War II Australian soldiers buried in, but also the First World War guys. But we did that. We garrisoned it for the rest of the war after we took it from Germany, and I have a wonderful photo of the Imperial Japanese Navy whilst the First World War, who were our allies in the First World War, reviewing Tropical Force, because Tropical Force was our garrison force. And not to backtrack too much, but our first expeditionary force that played a part in that in our first battle was the Australian Naval and Military Expedition Force, the ANMEF. So they do that. They withdraw back and they leave a garrison force in there. And I have a photo of the Imperial Japanese Navy officers reviewing our garrison force, tropical force. And at the end, at the conclusion, we had a seat not through Australia, but rather through Great Britain and Japan, who had lost, I think, about 800, mainly sailors, who had escorted our ships to the Dardanelles and battered well above its weight in this area with its naval capability, had said, hey, look, we want these territories. And of course Australia said no, we were accused of being racist, and we don't listen. We said no, we want that. And part of the conditions of the mandated territory was not to build up native troops into an army. This is not Papua, this is New Guinea, so the top part of mainland New Guinea and those islands, the main islands being East New Britain New Britain, and New Ireland. And it said, hey, look, you can't build fortifications, you can't train troops. Would have Japan listened to that? And if you give a quick chronology of the war on our doorstep, which encompasses everything we've talked about, including Dutch New Guinea, you have it whereby, by January of 42, Japan has entered the mandated territory in Rabaul. The battle doesn't go well for us. It only really lasts a day. And 23 January 42 is when Lark Force meets its doom. Most of those men would either, if they weren't killed in that initial battle, they flee. They go try and get back to Australia. Some do. Others are bayoneted and killed and shot and executed at the Toll Plantation Massacre and places like that. A lot of soldiers get on and civilians, I may add, on the Montevideo Maru, which is sunk off the coast of the Philippines in July that year by accidental fire, I guess, a friendly fire by, I think it was a USS Sturgeon submarine, thinking that it was a Japanese merchant ship or something. Sunk it, never been found, 1,200 odd lives lost on that. So this is and then Japan takes Rabaul and it holds it for the entire Second World War, because as I said before, the Americans, when they went on their island hopping campaign after 42, bypassed it. And so Japan has that, and from there they launch all their attacks on mainland New Guinea. After they took Rabaul and they size that up, the next thing for them to do is, of course, to come and land in New Guinea, and they take out Lark Force very quickly. They decimate Lark Force, which was mainly the 2nd 22nd Battalion from Victoria, and they either have to go killed in the first part or captured, or most of them go off every man for themselves in the jungle. A lot of them are either executed, like places like the Waitavo and the Toll Plantation Massacre, or they lose their life on the Montevideo Maru as a POW ship, 1,200, including mainly Australian soldiers and some civilians from Rabaul. So Japan takes Rabaul very early on. This is 23 January 1942, and from there they hold it for the rest of the war, and they use it for all of their other operations. They move very quickly. This is all in 1942, right? They move really quickly, and by March, so only a couple of months later, they've already landed on mainland New Guinea, because of course Rabaul is the capital of East New Britain, the island of. They land on mainland New Guinea, and they for the Ley and Salamau campaigns, and they get a foothold on there, and of course. Then they decide to move on and catch their prize, and their prize, of course, is Port Moresby, down in Papua, in Australian actual sovereign territory. The Port Moresby faces Australia, and it moves firstly to take it by sea in Operation MO, which we would better call Battle of the Coral Sea, 4th to the 8th of May. Very important for Australia. Doesn't go well for the Japanese. And after that, what do? On 21 July 42. This is all 1942 now. They land at a place called Basaboa on the north coast of Papua, on the northern beachheads. And, of course, that leads on to what we all know famously as the Kokoda Campaign. And they try to take Port Moresby by way of an overland track through the Owen Stanley. That doesn't go well for them, right? But they are putting, you imagine this pressure. And whilst that campaign's going on, Japan has done other things. They've started a battle with the Americans over on Guadalcanal. Huge fighting in the Pacific. They've also tried to get around through Port Moresby by attempting to come around the side at a place called Milne Bay. Happens in August of 42. So there's a lot of stuff a lot of stuff going on, right on our doorstep, and of course, it's not looking well for us. And to go over to where we're talking about in Dutch New Guinea, the Japanese continue their pressure, and they go and take out the Netherlands contingent over there. They go and remove them, and a lot of those forces of the Netherlands East Indies come back and have to come on our side with the Americans and the Australians. So there's a lot happening. So the Dutch colony over on in what is now West Papua didn't stand a chance. We nearly didn't stand a chance. So there is a lot of stuff happening over a huge landmass, but important on that continent of what we call New Guinea, or Papua New Guinea, and West Papuarian Jaya. All this stuff's going on our doorstep, and I think we've got to look beyond Kiribati. We've got to look beyond even Milk Bay, which is coming to the fore. Don't leave them behind. Give them the credit they're due. But we also, as I said earlier on, in the words of a great Australian military historian, John Laffin, said that the Dutch New Guinea campaign was the most arduous fought by any of the Allied troops in the Second World War, and that's mainly to do with its location, the type of terrain, and where it is. So, we should remember those who fought and obviously paid the ultimate sacrifice there.
Yeah, that's, mate. I'm just that from what the from what was said, from what you've just said, it sounds like it was a real tug of war, and like how we held on. It's just pure hard fighting, and by the sounds of it, just determination. And do you feel that do you feel that the Japanese because they had so many campaigns going on, do you feel that they just bit off more than they could chew, and they should have just prioritized like one of the, like, whether it was Guadalcanal or obviously the Dutch New Guinea, or West New Guinea, as we say, or what do you think of what I've just said?
Yeah, well, look, I think there's two schools of thought. One school of thought, of course, is that Japan was always going to sue for peace. Part of its initial, coming into the War of the Pacific with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and taking out American forces in what was then the American-controlled area in the Philippines. The whole idea was to take out as many of the naval assets that they could of the Americans. The Americans would come back down to the Philippines and try and they would give their decisive blow and sum up their territories and then sue for peace, because they knew that once they woke America up, the sleeping dragon, they wouldn't fare. But I think that it's important to note that it's very easy with revisionist history to look back and to say things like, that the Japanese had bit off more than they chew, leads to things like they were never going to invade Australia, and all of these things, which are all true, and we all know that in hindsight. But the point of the matter is, in that momentous year of 1942, we didn't know that. We as a country didn't know that. The young men and women and families back home and all that, we didn't know that was going to be the case, and it became one of not so much, saying, well, they can't come and get to us, but whereas people genuinely believed the Japanese were coming. And you may very well believe that. I mean, I think it's very important to even think in the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, here we are locked down because of COVID-19. Imagine what it would have been like. This is probably the closest that you or I and our generation can get to thinking about uncertainty, thinking about we don't know the outcome. I'm not comparing COVID-19 by any means to the Second World War, but that feeling of uncertainty, of uneasiness, of not knowing what's around the corner, all of this was played out in 1942 and beyond. And although we can look back with the eyes of hindsight in those days, I can tell you now it would have been a very, very scary place. And 42 could have gone either way.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Oh, 100%, Dave. And I guess, like you said, and we hit on a key point, like with the fall of Singapore. Well, many Australians would have thought that well, if they can take Singapore, they can definitely Australia's next. Like, and I'm sure that was the feeling that, and obviously when Darwin was being bombed. You could say that the threat would have been, and the thinking behind all Australians were that they are going to invade us, and obviously we know in hindsight that wasn't true, but back then absolutely I agree 100% in what you've said.
One important thing I would note on that, though, at least. To consider this is that I went and gave you that chronology, if you will, of the progression of Japanese aggression through the Pacific there. But when the Japanese entered into Papua, the sovereign territory of Australia, 21 July 42, came in law at least, they were on Australian soil. For the Dutch, when they entered in March of 42, when they went into Dutch New Guinea, they were on territory of the Netherlands. And for those people living there, let's not forget, not to debate the rights and wrong of colonialism, but don't forget, if you had been one of those people, whether it be what we call expats now, either from the Netherlands or from Australia, living in those territories up there, or you're a local person loyal and have been working, getting on with your life and all that, once the Japanese and their aggression came there, they had invaded. And that we shouldn't forget that, because for those people, it wasn't like it was something that was off in the distance or just a concern. They were living it, and that would have been pretty scary, I would suggest.
Oh, absolutely, and obviously we should, we shouldn't forget. It's a shame that we've forgotten for so long about the Dutch New Guinea campaign, but by the sounds of it, Dave, it actually sounds that it was one of our key and most important campaigns of the Second World War, from what you've said in this discussion.
Yeah, look, I think it. I think all of the battles fought in let's just call the whole area, for the terms of this discussion, New Guinea, whether that be Dutch New Guinea or the mandated territory of New Guinea or Papua. I think I think you're right. I think that these are significant, momentous battles and actions and things that I would like to see more of. I certainly would like to see more of in schools. I'd like to see more people pay attention and go beyond Kokoda. Again, I'm not taking away from that, and I think Kokoda is a great catalyst for people to get into it. And I would say this, and I could end on this note if I may. A lot of people come to me and say, look, my grandfather served in New Guinea. And, they're in Kokoda with this, but there's a huge area over many years, 42 to, or even a little bit earlier, if you were one of the earlier groups that went up to garrison these areas, knowing that the Japanese were going to invade, or the likelihood that invasion was coming. Let's use this time, the 75th anniversary in the Second World War, to go and find out more about our interaction with the territories to our immediate north.
Absolutely, it's like what you just said. That's a key point, and I think also too, Dave, why we've still got those veterans. We should hear their stories firsthand. They're still alive, and that's a resource that we can still use while they're still living. And the best way to be told is from the men who are actually fighting there. The New Guinea campaign was a really key, important campaign in the whole Pacific region.
Yeah.
That's what I take from it, and just one quick last point before I let you go. So so obviously with the battles that were going on in West New Guinea in 44, 45, so obviously the Japanese kept fighting right up. So was it they right up till the surrender? That was when the campaign sort of stopped, or what happened towards the end?
Yeah, so look, Australia's main involvement, they had a force called Meraku Force, and my pronunciation may not be correct, but Merauke Force. And whilst you've got to imagine towards the end of the war, as I said to you earlier, that the Americans had, or the United States forces had continued on their island hopping campaign, they bypassed a lot of, including Rabaul, which we discussed earlier on as the main base for them. But Australia basically wound down its garrison there. The Japanese couldn't really go anywhere. They didn't have assets like shipping and that to move them. Most of the fighting then had moved on to the north, the very top part of West Papua, but into those other campaigns that I mentioned, TP Wewak being the big one. And basically how it ended is that the Meraku Force had handed back to the Dutch. They came and they came and retake the administration of the area, because the Japanese had been withdrawing back and had been concentrating their efforts in other localities, like that ITP Wewak campaign that I mentioned before. And I guess I don't like to say that it just fizzled out, but the threat had moved on, and the fighting had moved on. And although I guess you can put a border and a line through it, it's all part of that overall operations to rid the Japanese out of that area, being, in this case, Dutch New Guinea, but also in the Mandated Territory of New Guinea. And I think it's important to sum up and say that, we ended up having about 3,500. By 43, we had 3,500 odd Australian troops in that area. They're just ground troops, and they had air assets there as well. Number 84 Squadron was there. You also had the Netherlands East Indies had their own squadron, in a joint squadron with Australian and Dutch, mainly equipped with Kitty Hawks. They got there in May of 44, and we put in a concentrated effort there. But I guess how to look at it is that the fighting really moved on and moved up into those other areas. And it was a continuation of that campaign. And I guess geography on a map, especially a map that we look at now, has meaningless, because you've got to look at the whole continent in its context of what you could say is New Guinea, and how it moved on. So, so look, long and short of it is, how did it end for us? It ended in the initial parts, down the bottom of the Japanese withdrawing, and the Australians basically building up a force to garrison, withdrawing that, dimming that force down, moving it on, withdrawing back, and then having those last big battles on that area up in the TP Wewak area. And that's where I said before that you've got some of the heavy losses for Australia. Of course, that's not to say that to take away the earlier part. And if I just go back one step there, some of the battles that I mentioned before that involved United States forces, which included huge amphibious landings, that went on up there, and which resulted in a victory for the Allies. All played a part in getting rid of the Japanese, and then eventually, because no one of the Allies wanted to hang on to it. Of course, it was Dutch controlled. They were our ally. And we handed back to them and then continued that fight. And look, it is a hot contested topic, because the final campaigns are won ones where it's still debated whether or not, as I said to you before, the Japanese should have stayed there. We should have just continued on, isolated them, left them where they are. They couldn't go anywhere. But it's a whole other argument. But the fact of the matter is they were on our immediate doorstep, although the battles had moved further north. For Australia, at least, and for our immediate allies, in this case the Dutch, we had an enemy that was still on our doorstep. We needed to get rid of them, and that is exactly what we did.